Growing up inside a family that lived its emotional life in front of cameras meant that Christine's sons learned very early how to observe before they ever learned how to speak. They didn't always understand the full weight of the tensions around them when they were young, but they felt them. Children always do. They sensed when voices changed. They noticed when laughter felt forced. They picked up on the quiet moments when their mother's smile didn't last as long as it used to. Christine was the emotional heart of their home. She was warmth, she was routine, she was comfort. From early mornings filled with school preparations to late nights filled with homework and quiet talks, she was always present. She gave everything she had to her children. But even in the safety of that love, the boys could feel the strain their mother carried. They saw how much she poured into everyone else. And slowly, without anyone ever saying it out loud, they began to realize how little she was receiving in return. As boys, they didn't yet have the language to describe emotional imbalance. They only knew the feeling of heaviness that sometimes settled into the house after certain conversations. They knew how their mother's voice sounded when she tried to stay strong through disappointment. They learned how to read the room before speaking. They learned when it was better to retreat into silence instead of asking questions that might bring tension into the open. They watched her wait. They watched her hope. They watched her try again and again to be seen in ways that didn't always happen. Children build their understanding of love by watching their parents. Christine's sons learned love through endurance, through patience, through loyalty, through showing up even when it hurt. And while those are powerful lessons, they are also heavy ones to carry so young. They saw how often their mother put the family first, even when it cost her emotionally. They saw her hide tears behind quick smiles. They saw her pull herself together so no one would worry. And they felt the quiet responsibility of wanting to protect her without fully understanding how. The house was never quiet in the ordinary sense. It was full of movement, voices, schedules, and obligations. But there was a different kind of quiet that settled into Christine's space over the years, a quiet that came from emotional waiting, from uncertainty, from hoping for connection that never fully stabilized. And the boys grew up inside that quiet. As they got older, they began to understand more clearly what they had been sensing all along. They began to recognize patterns, moments where their mother's needs were postponed, moments where her feelings were minimized, moments where her effort outpaced what she received. They didn't understand the complexity of adult relationships yet, but they understood fairness, and in their eyes, something didn't feel fair. They learned early how to be gentle with her, how to listen when she needed to talk, how to sit beside her when words weren't necessary. They became emotionally aware in ways children often shouldn't have to be so young. They didn't know it then, but those emotional instincts were shaping the men they would become. As teenagers, they grew more protective, not in loud ways, in quiet ways. They noticed when she came home drained after difficult conversations. They noticed when her energy dipped after moments that should have brought comfort. They noticed how often she carried emotional weight alone. And even though they never positioned themselves as her emotional caretakers, they instinctively tried to lighten her burden wherever they could. They helped more. They checked in more. They stayed close without needing to say why. Some sons grow up idolizing their fathers. Christine's sons grew up learning how to stand beside their mother. That didn't mean they didn't love their father. They did. But their emotional loyalty formed around the person who showed up consistently, who created safety, who made space for vulnerability without judgment. Over time, they understood who they could talk to when they were hurting, who would listen without defensiveness, who would comfort without conditions. And that person was always their mother. They learned what emotional reliability looked like by watching her live it every day. As the years passed and tensions inside the family grew more visible, the boys began to understand that their mother's pain wasn't just situational. It was structural. It came from years of emotional uncertainty, unmet needs, and a sense of invisibility that no one should have to carry inside their own marriage. They didn't analyze it with adult language. They simply felt it, and feeling it made them fiercely loyal. When the emotional cracks finally reached a point where Christine could no longer carry everything silently, her sons were not surprised by her sadness. They had lived inside it with her for years. They didn't see weakness in her struggle. They saw courage. They saw endurance. They saw sacrifice. And when the world later reacted loudly to her choices, the boys already understood what many outsiders did not. They knew how long she had waited. They knew how hard she had tried. They knew how deeply she had loved. And they knew, without needing debate, that her pain was real. They didn't need explanations when she finally chose herself. They had already been carrying that truth with her long before she ever spoke it aloud. Part 1 ends here, inside the quiet, emotional world where Christine's sons learned loyalty not through speeches, but through years of watching their mother endure in silence. As Christine's sons grew from boys into young men, their understanding of the family shifted in ways that felt both slow and sudden at the same time. Childhood had been about instinct, about feeling when something was wrong without needing to define it. Adulthood brought awareness. They began to connect the dots between the tension they had felt for years and the reality of what their mother had been living inside every day. Their relationship with their father began to change quietly at first. When they were younger, his presence still carried a kind of authority that felt immovable. He was the one who made rules. He was the one whose approval seemed to matter. Even when things felt uncomfortable, they still tried to please him. They still sought moments of connection. They still believed that effort would be returned with closeness. But as they grew older, they started to notice patterns they couldn't ignore. They noticed how conversations turned into lectures. They noticed how disagreement was often seen as disrespect. They noticed how emotion was met with defensiveness instead of curiosity. And most of all, they noticed how often their mother's feelings seemed to be pushed aside when they should have been protected. At first, they told themselves it was normal. Families fight, parents get frustrated, life gets messy. But over time, normal stopped feeling like an explanation and started feeling like an excuse. As young men, they began forming their own identities, their own beliefs, their own sense of self-worth. And with that growth came a stronger sense of emotional boundaries. They no longer accepted being dismissed without feeling it deeply. They no longer stayed silent when something felt unfair. They began asking questions, not to challenge authority for the sake of it, but because they needed to understand where they fit emotionally in a family that felt increasingly divided. Their relationship with their father became strained in ways that were difficult to articulate. It wasn't constant fighting. It was distance, phone calls that felt awkward, visits that felt tense, moments where words were exchanged but connection was missing. They still tried to engage, they still made effort, but every attempt felt heavier than the last, as if they were walking into emotional spaces where they already expected disappointment. At the same time, their bond with their mother deepened, not because she asked them to take sides, not because she spoke badly about anyone, but because they saw how much she carried on her own. They saw the emotional weight in her eyes. They heard the exhaustion in her voice after difficult days. They felt the shift in energy when she had tried and been disappointed again. And without needing to be told, they understood that her emotional world had been shrinking for a long time. They became more vocal among themselves. They talked about fairness. They talked about effort. They talked about how family was supposed to feel. Those conversations weren't filled with anger at first. They were filled with confusion, with hurt, with the quiet sadness that comes from realizing something you believed in may not be what you thought it was. As time passed, frustration entered the picture. Not explosive rage, quiet, simmering frustration. They felt protective of their mother in a way that only sons who have watched their parents suffer in silence can feel. They didn't want to fight, they didn't want to escalate, but they also didn't want to keep watching her pain alone. And then came the period that changed everything. Rules, ultimatums, distance that was no longer emotional but physical. Suddenly, access to their father felt conditional. Presence came with requirements instead of openness. And that shift hurt in places they didn't yet know how to explain. Love was not supposed to feel transactional. Family was not supposed to feel earned. The more they were asked to prove loyalty through obedience, the more unseen they felt as individuals. They were no longer being met as sons with their own emotional experiences. They were being measured against expectations that left no room for disagreement without consequence. That broke something inside them, for the first time. And they saw that. By the time the emotional tension reached its peak, the sons were no longer confused boys sensing something was wrong. They were young men who understood exactly what they had been watching for years. They understood that their mother had been emotionally alone inside her marriage. They understood that waiting had cost her pieces of herself. And they understood that silence had not protected her. That understanding changed how they saw everything. They stopped waiting for things to go back to normal. They realized that what they thought was normal had been broken for a long time. And in that realization, something began to shift inside them too. The silence they had learned as children no longer felt protective. It felt complicit. And the thought that one day their truth might need to be spoken for her, for all the years she had absorbed quietly, began forming in their hearts long before any cameras ever captured it. The silence didn't break all at once. It fractured slowly, under the weight of years that had gone unresolved. Christine's sons had spent so long learning how to stay quiet, how to absorb emotion without releasing it, how to protect without confronting. But silence, when held too long, doesn't disappear. It either turns into distance or it turns into truth. For a long time, they chose distance. They focused on their own lives, their own growth, their own healing. They built routines that didn't require constant emotional negotiation. They leaned into friendships that felt safe. They created spaces where their voices mattered without needing to be measured or managed. And in doing so, they found something they hadn't realized they were missing for years: emotional stability. But no matter how far they moved forward, they could never fully detach from what they had watched their mother endure. Every time her pain resurfaced in their memory, every time her story was questioned publicly, every time her strength was misread as weakness, something stirred inside them that was impossible to ignore. They weren't angry at the world. They were tired of watching the truth be distorted by silence. And the truth was simple. They had seen what she carried. They had lived inside the emotional consequence of it. And they knew better than anyone how long she had endured without ever asking her children to fight for her. That restraint protected the family for years, but it also protected the narrative that hid what those years had truly cost her. There came a moment, not a dramatic one, not a planned one, when one of the sons realized that staying silent no longer felt like protection. It felt like participation in erasure. Not of facts, but of emotional reality, of what had happened behind closed doors when the cameras weren't focused on spectacle, but on survival. They didn't want to attack anyone. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want to rewrite history. They simply wanted to tell the truth. And truth doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes through calm words spoken after years of holding them back. When they finally spoke, it wasn't in rage. It was in honesty. They spoke about watching their mother try again and again, about seeing her hope rise and fall,
about the quiet nights when she carried disappointment without complaint, about the way she waited for emotional consistency that never quite settled in, about how she never turned her children into emotional weapons, about how she protected them from the full weight of what she was carrying. Those words stunned people, not because they were harsh, but because they were measured. There was no cruelty in them. There was grief. There was clarity. There was loyalty, spoken not through attack, but through protection. For fans who had spent years debating motives, assigning blame, and speculating about unseen dynamics, the son's words cut through the noise with a different kind of power. Not the power of accusation, the power of witness. They weren't speaking as commentators. They were speaking as children who had lived inside the story. They explained what it felt like to grow up watching their mother shrink emotionally, what it felt like to mature into awareness and realize that what they had sensed as children was not imagination, what it felt like to understand as men that love should not require someone to disappear. They spoke about loyalty, not as blind obedience, but as emotional truth. They made it clear that their bond with their mother had been built through presence, consistency, and protection, not through fear or control. They described how watching her finally choose herself didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like relief. And that shook people. Because the narrative had long positioned their mother as fragile, dramatic, or reactive. What the sons revealed was very different. They revealed endurance. They revealed patience. They revealed a woman who stayed longer than her heart could handle because she didn't want to fracture the family. They revealed a woman who finally left, not because she stopped loving, but because she could no longer survive on absence. Fans didn't expect that level of calm honesty. They didn't expect protection without hostility. They didn't expect emotional clarity without bitterness. But perhaps most of all, they didn't expect the sons to speak with such grounded certainty. Because certainty only comes from lived truth. And when that truth finally entered the public space, it shifted the emotional weight of the entire story. This wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about what children carry when a parent suffers quietly for years. It was about what happens when sons grow into men who understand that silence can protect, but it can also obscure. Their voices didn't arrive to escalate conflict. They arrived to end confusion. They arrived to place emotional truth back in the center of a story that had been dissected in fragments for years. And once that truth was spoken, it could not be unseen. When the son's words reached the public, the reaction was immediate, but not in the way many people expected. There was no explosion of chaos, no shouting matches, no sudden dramatic reversals. Instead, there was a quiet pause across the audience, the kind that happens when people realize they may have misunderstood a story for a very long time. For years, fans had watched fragments of the family through edited scenes. They had interpreted emotion through brief moments on screen. They had debated motives through assumptions. But the sons' voices shifted to perspective in a way nothing else ever had. They were not outsiders reacting to a story. They were living testaments to what that story had cost behind the scenes. What made their honesty so powerful was not what they accused, but what they acknowledged. They acknowledged how long their mother had tried. They acknowledged how deeply she believed in the family. They acknowledged how carefully she protected everyone, even while hurting. That kind of truth doesn't invite argument. It invites reflection. Fans who had once questioned Christine's decisions began to understand the emotional timeline behind them. The choice to leave was no longer seen as sudden. It was seen as inevitable. Not because she was weak, but because she had waited beyond the limits of what her heart could sustain. And the son's calm certainty confirmed what many had begun to sense but never fully understood. The most unexpected shift came in how people viewed the sons themselves. They were no longer seen as background figures in the larger family drama. They were seen as men shaped by emotional awareness far beyond their years. Men who had watched, learned, and carried responsibility quietly. Men who had chosen truth without choosing cruelty. That alone surprised many. In reality TV, emotion often arrives loudly. It demands attention through confrontation. But the sons chose a different path. They didn't shout their truth. They offered it. And that made it impossible to dismiss. Their words reframed the emotional history of the family in a way that was impossible to undo. It became clear that this was not simply a story of adults choosing different paths. It was a story of children growing up inside emotional imbalance and learning over time how that imbalance shaped everything. They spoke about loyalty, not as something demanded, but as something earned. They described how their bond with their mother was forged through years of consistent presence, not by instruction, but by example. They showed that emotional safety is not a slogan, it is something proven in daily life. And through that lens, everything changed. Christine was no longer just the woman who left. She was the woman her children chose to stand beside. For many fans, that realization landed with unexpected force. Because children do not protect lightly. They do not defend without reason. Their loyalty, when freely given, speaks volumes about what they have witnessed. What the sons revealed most clearly was that their mother had never positioned herself as a victim in front of them. She never recruited them into her pain. She never taught them to carry bitterness. She simply lived her truth quietly until they were old enough to recognize it for themselves. And when they finally saw it clearly, they chose to speak.